Hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 96 of SCOTONOMICS. Got a wonderful interview this evening around the Treasury, and we'll be doing some myth busting around this idea of the Treasury view and its impact it has on the British economy. So welcome to everyone who's joining us for the live show tonight. And as always, I'd like to welcome my co-host for this evening. Hello, Karen Van Sweden. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yes, it's been an interesting week for economics, isn't it? Of course, with the budget. I've been listening to the Resolution Foundation discussion about it. So I'm trying to get as many points of view about it as possible. The other thing I wanted to bring up today for our audience as well was an article that you shared, which was fantastic. It was an article by the economist Angus Deaton. And I
put a link in the for you all to have a look at that. You really should read it. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's fabulous. I mean, it's really good that, someone with that caliber who wrote a really fantastic book. He's written another one recently, but he wrote one with Anne Case called Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. And, him saying, I think that I got it wrong in lots and lots of ways.
Yeah, it's a very short article, but I think it'll be a really important one. My summary was that he basically said economists, mainstream economists, have to start thinking much more like heterodox economists. They have to start looking at the real world and bringing in the other social sciences, which is a huge part of what a heterodox economist does. Short article, won't take you more than a few minutes to read, but please do have a read. For me, it's one of those kind of signs. Hopefully we'll point back in a few years and say, there's another thing that showed us that the mainstream was ready to change and adopt these ideas. In the interview I've got with Aeron now, I talk about our view of economics being forward-looking, modern monetary theory, ecological economics, degrowth, well-being economy, community wealth building. And the problem with a lot of institutions in the UK and globally is that their economics always looks back and never looks to the future. So hopefully this will be a really important article. Before I show the interview with Aeron now, do you just want to give a very brief little summary? Because I know you watched it and you thought it was really good. So what do you hope that the audience will take away from this one, Karen?
Yeah, I think the main points that came across were that siloization that exists, but also the complete change in economic thinking that happened around about the 70s, that not only happened within the Treasury, but it was also being forced into academia across the world, really, the Friedman thinking about a lot of things. Just, we can all see how damaging that has been. But there are lots of really interesting. Another interesting point that came up was the equinocracy. So I'm going to look into that as well at the end of the show.
Okay, and you have to remind me what that was, because I've forgotten. I did interview Aeron after a very busy day last week. Now, I promise you this is really, really interesting. When I spoke to Aeron, we were thinking, how can we make this fairly dry topic about the Treasury exciting? I think we did it. It's a 45-minute interview. I hope you enjoy it. Please do throw in loads of thoughts and comments. My one big question for you is, think about the current plan for Scottish independence as we go through this, and you hear Aeron talk about the Treasury and what the Treasury view is, and really think, is this one of the institutions that we want still involved in our economy after we're independence? I'd love you to think about that, as well as the role of the Treasury in the wider UK economy. Enjoy this. We'll be back in about 45 minutes time. Aeron Davis, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of SCOTONOMICS. It's wonderful to have an English author based in New Zealand, talk about economics. So I'm sure there's loads of topics we can go into. We're actually here specifically to talk about your wonderful book, Bankruptcy, Bubbles and Bailouts, which I read just a couple of weeks ago. I want to get into the details of that. Thanks very much for joining us to talk about it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So my first question, I'm an economist. I'm definitely influenced by this, by institutionalism, looking at the economy through the institutions. So I found this book fascinating. It's an insight into a particular institution, and that's the really important institution of the UK Treasury. And you said it in the book, and I agree completely, but this institution, the Treasury, has escaped this type of investigation. So thanks very much for writing it. Is the lack of awareness of the role of the Treasury, was that one of the main reasons that you decided to write the book?
Yes, that was a key driver. I mean, I've looked at politics and economics for years and years, and the Treasury gets avoided for all sorts of reasons, partly because that's what it wants to avoid, and partly because academics tend to focus on other things. I mean, if you think about the Treasury, it's a boring subject, and to many people,
me.
No, not to everyone, but to the wider world, it's a boring institution about numbers and spreadsheets and accounting and all of that. So it doesn't immediately jump out as a topic for sort of wider interest. So what you do get is you have a lot of books by people who were there, mostly politicians, who tell you how wonderful they did. Or you get these very sort of detailed academic accounts of changes in accounting and structures within the Treasury, which are very dull to anyone but someone really interested in those sorts of matters. So that's one reason it doesn't get out. The other reason is
which is not true, because I don't want people switching off from this interview, which is not true. It's a fascinating institution with loads of brilliant stories, and we're going to go into them.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to play it down too much. I wanted to get the human story. I wanted to get the focus on the humans, focus on the people and the social circumstances, while being able to offer a critical interrogation of what was happening at the institution. And I thought there was a gap there. And people around me who encouraged me to write the book, people at Manchester University, Business School especially. I don't know if you've come across Carol Williams and his group of sort of more radical business historians and others. And I'd written something on the Treasury, and they very much encouraged me. They said, no one's really writing on the Treasury. You need to write a book on the Treasury, Aeron. You need to bring it out more into the light. And I sort of agreed, and that was a big motivating factor. And the other reason it's a more hidden thing is on the one side, civil servants and departments try and stay in the background whenever possible, while the politicians are the front people for politics. But they're doing an awful lot. And the Treasury is even more in the background because the Treasury is an inward-facing department. Pretty much every other department of state relates to the wider world, business, health, education, whatever. But the Treasury just deals with other departments. And so they don't want a sort of a presence and an engagement with the public, except when it comes to budgets and stuff. And they're there behind the Chancellor. So you see the Chancellor, but you don't see the Treasury. And therefore, what it does and the power it has is very much hidden. It goes under the radar all the time. So yeah, those are sort of the motivations to push me to write the book.
Well, I'm really pleased you did. I really enjoyed it. You've alluded already to the role of the Treasury, but do you want to give us a little bit of a summary for certainly someone who's not read the book yet or not aware? Like you said, it's kind of slightly opaque, the Treasury. Yeah, I've heard it, I know what it does, but could you explain its kind of role, its importance within the UK government, and then also maybe talk about if it's changed over the period of time? Was it really influential? Is it losing influence? Has it always had influence? That'd be fascinating for us to hear.
It's always been very influential. It was probably the first department of state, really, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And kings had to raise money in order to fight wars and do other things. And the Prime Minister was originally thought of as called the First Lord of the Treasury, and the Chancellor the Second Lord. We no longer think of the Prime Minister as the First Lord anymore, but that's how it started and that's how it came about. But basically its role, and as government has expanded, its primary role is to bring in money and control spending. And so every other department of state has to go and doff its cap to the Treasury and say, we want some more money for this or that. And part of that comes through the ministers sort of negotiating with the Chancellor, sometimes the Prime Minister in the background, but very often senior officials going and talking to the Treasury. I mean, these days, the Treasury has a number of staff members in every department. It's sort of like they're hovering around and already discussing and already have an eye on what's happening in those departments. And that's to have an ever-present sort of thing. It's a bit like, don't know what you call it, the Masons or something. It's that's the wrong thing, but it's almost
probably
like
not that.
society.
Probably
Everyone
not that
knows
far
they're
off.
there, but they're there in the background.
Yeah.
And they're actually a very tiny department compared to other departments, but a very powerful one. And it's supposed to be the cream of the civil service end up in the Treasury. Anyone who, not everyone, but most aspiring, ambitious civil servants end up in the Treasury. That's supposed to be where the best civil servants go. So very capable, pretty powerful, pretty hidden. And that's how they are.
You sourced a lot of the stories from all of the biographies of the top civil servants who were in the Treasury, and also politicians, but kind of mainly chancellors. And there's so many wonderful stories from then. And when I got to the end of the book, I found it fascinating that if this was a story, if this was a film, the cast was almost exclusively male. There was hardly, there's never been, as you'll know, there's never been a female Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, but there was so few females in this whole story, apart from the 3 prime ministers who we come to the end towards the book, or 2.5, I think I said, including Liz Truss as the half. Did I miss the influence of the woman in this really powerful organisation, or was it just never there?
It was never really there. I mean, I have to say, I looked through the list, and there's 3 people on my list of interviewees, and there's actually 3 others, which was like there were a certain set of people I had to keep anonymous. And I think literally half the people who are anonymous are women, 2 of them very senior figures. And these people insisted they'd only talk to me off the record, and I couldn't list them. But
that's interesting in itself, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Yes. That's
well. I wanted to say, before the Treasury book, I've spent a large part of my career interviewing very powerful elite people in government, in business, in finance, and nearly all these worlds, they're very much male dominated. I mean, if you look at the FTSE 100, there's never more than a handful of CEOs who are women. Or I haven't looked in the last year or 2. And sometimes there's only 1 or 2 or 3 at any one point. And in finance, again, there's very, very few. And it's the same in the Treasury. There's never been, not only has there not been a woman chancellor, there hasn't been a woman permanent secretary or second permanent secretary. To be honest, I don't know what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years. There could be now, but there hasn't been before then. So I did actually I was aware of this issue. I've always been aware. But also, and I do seek out women when I do these studies because I want to sort of get another perspective. But they're also the most often quite reluctant to go on the record and speak. And that may be because they feel they're in this male-dominated world and feel more anxious about it.
Fascinating. It's also worth saying that it's a predominantly white cast as well. The lack of diversity is what I picked up on that, and in any situation, in any institution, groupthink arises when all the people in the room look the same and think the same. And it's really, and we'll tease this out, I think, when we talk about this Treasury view, but it did seem like everyone was so similar that the views are bound to be the same. And then another kind of joking question was, looking at all of those economists, I take it there was loads of Marxist economists, feminist economists there. There must have been quite a few ecological economists. Was it institutionalists? It's not just this neoclassical economist. Surely there must be wanting to have as broad a view of the economy as possible? He knows, knowing fine well what the answer to this is, Aeron.
Well, as you know, the answer is no. I mean, it's mostly peopled with neoclassical mainstream economists who have a formal education, a narrow view. They often come quite soon after their education, haven't had much of a world experience outside of theoretical economics, and then they pursue that. So there isn't a great deal of variety but I mean, I did meet a few more enlightened people, but those enlightened people still have very much both feet or three quarter 1 foot and 4/5 of 1 foot still in the other foot in that camp. But if you talk to people like Gus O'Donnell or Adair Turner or Andy Haldane, when I thought about that, they were the sort of more broad-minded people. When I say that, they were capable of thinking outside the narrow box. And I mean, Gus O'Donnell did say to me, I said, what was the big change over your time in the Treasury? And he said, the economists took over. And he meant the mainstream economists. And he said, in 2007-8, I realized we really could have done with economic historians, behavioral economists, other kinds of thinking. And I said, well, has it changed much? And he said, oh, we're much more broad now, but I didn't buy that bit. But he certainly thought you needed that broad perspective. And Adair Turner obviously read, I don't think he was a real economist. I can't remember what he originally studied, but he obviously had a critical take and was open to other ideas that would be considered heresy in sort of mainstream economics departments. And Andy Haldane at the Bank of England was similar in that he became well known for coming up with a different view. But he was in the Bank of England, and that always sort of amazed me that he stuck around as long as he did in the Bank of England with his very contrary views, often left-wing business economy circles.
He did, and I used to run the events for the Council of Mortgage Lenders and the British Bankers Association, and I was always trying to get Andy Haldane to come and speak at my events, and my boss was always saying, he's just the chief economist, get one of the MPC to come and speak. But I always thought that you got a very different perspective, much more of a real world perspective. I think he's recently, either today, it was the budget in the UK today, but I think he was talking about either the need for the fiscal framework or the way that it's calculated to be something that we're looking at. So I think he is still quite happy to be a little bit of a contrary, but I think that's still within a very kind of defined neoclassical view. I don't think it's as wide as having a Marxist sitting at the table saying that capitalism is full of crisis and there's nothing you can do to avoid it. That leads us on, I think, to that groupthink, and something that a lot of listeners and viewers might have already come across is this idea of the Treasury view. It's something that's quite well known within British economics and politics. Would you like to give us a kind of understanding of what is this Treasury view? Can you explain what people mean and what you observed when you were talking to people about this idea of the Treasury view?
Early on, it became one of my questions when I would talk to people in the Treasury, what is the Treasury view? And I realized some bits are generally agreed upon and other bits aren't. And other bits aren't mentioned, but I just decided they had become the Treasury view in the last 40, 50 years. But in terms of what has become the Institute sort of raison d'etre, guidelines for their behavior, there are some clear things. And these supposedly trace back. Well, the first one is balancing the books, and that traces back to its origin. So you have to keep the books balanced whenever possible, and you have to fight off the various interests that try and wreck the books for you. So that's principle number one. But what seems to have developed since William Gladstone's time, when he was Chancellor for many years and Prime Minister, was other principles which seem to be followed right up until now. And one of those is definitely a belief in free markets and market ways of doing things, even though they're a government ministry. That's a hardcore belief now. Second is a belief in free trade, which ties in well with globalization. Third is a belief in necessity of getting price stability. And what they mean by that these days is keeping the pound on a level so it doesn't zigzag up and down, and keeping inflation low. And therefore, that's the basis of a good economy. So those are the classic bits. And I think most people agree that's the Treasury view. But in my mind, obviously, well, other things have become the Treasury view too. And one of those was the switch from Keynesianism and fiscal activism to monetarism. And that very much happened in the end of the 70s and is here still. But the three other
and to summarize that for the audience, that's an understanding that you can control the economy by monetary policy, moving the interest rate up and down, rather than trying to use fiscal policy, government spending, government taxation to control the economy. So you think that's now part of the Treasury view, that kind of almost that fourth kind of plank?
Oh, definitely. And I mean, I talked to every permanent secretary up till Tom Scholar, who was unceremoniously dumped by Liz Truss when she arrived. And every one of them from 1983 to 2022. And I felt that was a very strong line that they took. Maybe the different chancellors and governments that came in maybe had slightly different ideas, but they often connected to that. And that was the Treasury line. Basically, fiscal levers, you can't really do much with fiscal levers anymore. The world's changed. That's old hat. Anyone who does that is sort of trying to fight a fire with a handkerchief or something. It's forget that. What you should be doing is those other things. Is using monetarist levers, interest rates. That's it.
That's it. Yeah.
But then I found, in terms of the Treasury view, there were three other things which I have 3 chapters on, which seem to me to be strong lines of Treasury policy, unofficial policy. And one was picking finance over industry. And that seemed to me a very clear theme over the last 50 years. 2 was globalization, which connected to free trade. And there are some views on what that globalization was, but very much a sort of let's integrate with the economies of the rest of the world as much as possible. And thirdly was this sort of privatized Keynesianism. I sort of title it different things, magic money trees or whatever, which is, and that privatized Keynesianism, that term comes originally from Colin Crouch, from something he wrote, I can't remember, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, which is basically, although the state stopped fiscal activism, stopped trying to stimulate the economy through taxation, they instead encouraged the market to do it in various ways. So it didn't appear like the state was doing it, but the state was doing it through different means, like state sell-offs of assets, private credit creation, PFI, all these things. So it looked like the state was not doing anything visibly, but undercover they were doing lots of things to try and stimulate and activate the economy. So I thought that, although that wasn't a principle of the Treasury view, it sort of
the outcome of it.
Done so regularly.
Well, that's fascinating, because now that you've gone through that, I said I read the book, but it didn't come across kind of as clearly as that. And I'm thinking, the Treasury is supposed to be not political. It's supposed to be apolitical. Most of this fits very neatly into what you would describe as the center right of politics. That whole view is much more comfortable there. That's an observation that I think people must have. This natural view seems to be, conservative with a small c, but towards the right of politics and of economics. I think that's really interesting. And the other thing I would pick up is that people shouldn't be surprised that these were the views taken because of this herd mentality. But of course, and this is where the institutionalism comes in, which is, you know, I'm influenced by, of course, people who are based next to the city of London and who went to school with people who ended up in the financial services, of course, they're going to favour the financial services sector because they don't know any people who own mines. They don't know the car manufacturing. And it's I kind of wanted to get into this institutional view of economics, that you can look at it from this economic perspective, but also you're seeing how these institutions are shaped and the direction of the economy is shaped by the people within them. And I think you've summarized that beautifully in the view. That view looks like what you would expect a wealthy, middle-class, middle-aged white man who was born in the south of England, went to a private school. That's what you would expect him to think. It's no coincidence that that was the view of the Treasury. So that's incredible to hear it so succinctly. Spoke about this Treasury view, but was it affected by any events? Did it change in any way? You know, and I kind of thought about, you know, when the UK government was really trying to stay to the gold standard. When it came off the gold standard, did this have a big impact on this Treasury review? And what about the 1976 engagement from the IMF in the UK economy? Was there any events that really changed the Treasury and they thought, we need to change our view or we need to harden our view? Any events that had that impact?
I didn't look at before 1976. Although, you know, I was aware of the history and I read it basically, but my sort of focus was 1976 plus in terms of what was happening in the institution. I mean, one thing I'll say is well, before I started this, I thought we had this switch from Keynesianism to monetarism. But as I learned, as I discovered talking to people and looking more at the history, for many people, Keynes was just a temporary blip in the history of the Treasury. And actually, he didn't fit, but his ideas fitted and made sense in the 1930s from the Depression, and were very influential all the way up until the 1970s when it suddenly didn't work. So as long as it was working, they went with it, but the default was not Keynes at all. Was to flip back to the kind of things they were doing before.
So they were always reluctant when it came to fiscal policy and Keynesianism. There was always a reluctance.
Yes, it wasn't their natural thing to do. But yeah, 1976, I think, if nothing else, said to people in power, the Keynesian regime was not working. How they operated. And funny, if you talk to people, I remember talking to people who were there pre-76, and them saying, you had this book, I can't remember what it was called, and it sort of told you what to do. If inflation went to this, you press these levers. If unemployment went to this, you press those levers. And you didn't have to be an economist. In fact, most of them weren't economists, but you had these guidelines that had been set by Keynes and his followers, and this is what you did. And after 1976, that book didn't work. You know, it was a bit like scientific experiment, and the chemicals you mix suddenly didn't come up with the result you had been expecting for the last 30 years. So it no longer, you had to find something else. So 76 was sort of the start of a reversion to prior thinking and behaviors, I think, with important differences. But I would have said the key challenges to the Treasury orthodoxy were the great financial crisis of 2007-8 and COVID 2020. And why it was a great challenge is because suddenly the Treasury, which its whole life says no as much as possible to people wanting to spend money, suddenly said yes. Oh, hundreds of billions. Yes, we have to do it. And I think Tom Scholar, the permanent secretary, and he was around in 2007-8 as a senior figure too. He said to me, these things were unthinkable until they became inevitable. There was a major crisis. The only way through it was to pour hundreds of billions at it. There was no other way. Otherwise, collapse of the economy, potential collapse of society. And so they did it. And those events went completely against what, the the Treasury view.
This is this huge kind of fiscal support that we're talking about, which is very anti what they were doing. Okay, so sorry.
Yes. Yeah. So the impossible suddenly became possible in an emergency. But of course, both periods are followed by the same result, which is the Treasury and a Conservative-led government saying, oh, now we have to wind that back and cut as much as possible and pay back these hundreds of billions of debt that we've created, which they can't do and they don't do. But that is the automatic. This was a blip. We had to do it, but that, now we have to get back to sensible day-to-day Treasury viewpoints. And so that's what happens. I mean, you could pick up other events that shook the Treasury. Brexit shook the Treasury because, again, it went against a lot of their key principles, which was about globalization and free trade. And a lot of people don't know this, but the Treasury was very much involved with the common market and the setting that up and the rules by which the European Union came to operate as a sort of single market. And they were very much, they had some leaders involved in that. And they were very much bought into that. And their whole thinking about how the British economy runs financially and industrially related to that, related to being part of the European Union. So that was a big blow. I would say 1992, when they had to withdraw from the ERM and potentially couldn't join the euro after that, was another sort of blow in terms of their thinking. But yeah, I would say 2007-8 and 2020 showed it doesn't have to be that way.
There is another alternative. Some of the most colourful characters in the book are former chancellors. Some of your stories about them are great. Like George Osborne, for example, I think he laughed that a university could be so mad as to give him like an honorary economics degree because he said he knew nothing about economics. I mean, what are your favourite moments from meeting these people face to face? Shocked, surprised, entertained, baffled? What are your stories from that period?
Well, that is, I mean, you pick one of my favourite moments. When he said yes, and they gave me an honorary doctorate, and he was so embarrassed at it, he laughed because he openly admitted he'd never studied economics really. I mean, you have all these interviews, and some are quite disappointing because they tell you very little and they give you an official line, and other people are very interesting either because they just tell you anything and everything, or because they turn out to be a very different person, because they have a front, they have a political front, and they're very different in private. I mean, George Osborne was one of those, and before I met him, I had a pretty critical view, and he had a sort of reputation as a sort of quite a harsh person. But the time I met him, he was working at the Standard. He was no longer in the Treasury. That's when he stepped down from politics, and he hadn't been in the Standard long. But the way he was talking to people around him, he was a very nice man, and he was very nice to me. No doubt, if I was someone else, he might have been very horrible. But that seemed to be his way. He actually was quite charming and managed everyone around him at the same time very well. I was waiting in his office and waiting for him and then talking to him. But I don't want to say that's okay then, of course, because of what he did. But in terms of wonderful discussions, I did have some great discussions, and quite often I was amazed at the way they went. I mean, Philip Hammond spilled the beans a lot because he couldn't, because he'd left. He didn't care. His parliamentary career was over as far as he was concerned. It didn't matter what he said. And he kept saying, oh, that's a bit fruity. You can't quote me direct on that. While telling me how awful everyone was in government. And not everyone, but the whole Boris Johnson mob, and what they did. So that, some of those quotes got in. Gus O'Donnell was a fascinating conversation. I'd tried for years to speak to Gus O'Donnell, and he kept fobbing me off over a number of years. At one point, he offered me a 20-minute conversation while he was on a plane somewhere, and I sort of didn't take him up on it. Anyway,
Politely declined that one.
Several years after he had agreed to an appointment after he'd left the civil service, and he was still very busy. And on the day, my appointment was changed about 3 times, and I was thinking, oh no, this is going to be terrible, and I'm going to end up with 20 minutes. You know, the venue changed 3 times in the same day. And then when I actually sat down with him, he talked to me really openly for an hour and a quarter, and he clearly had a lot of views that he agreed and disagreed with government policy and stuff, and he very openly said all these things. And so what I thought was going to be a terrible interview was turn out really well and really insightful. But I think probably my favorite is with Ken Clarke, which I had over in New Zealand. And Ken Clarke, it was obviously, well, maybe not everyone remembers this, a key figure in the Thatcher years. And he, in effect, was John Major's right-hand person. In fact, sort of did more to keep government stable during those years than anyone else during the 1990s.
He was the Chancellor during that period, wasn't he?
He was Chancellor. He came in after Norman Lamont was sacked, and the government seemed to be flailing around, and he stabilized things quite a bit up until 1997, and he put all sorts of things in place, but he was just a sensible figure. But the thing is, I associated him with classic Thatcherism, but many years later, since he's retired from politics, what was great to hear was he had a really enlightened view, and he said we went wrong. The high point of the new regime was sort of the early 2000s, and it's been going wrong ever since. And you know, I didn't know this was going to happen. We didn't know this is where it was going to lead us, and that we're going to end up with great inequality. And he started talking more and more. He sounded more to the left of the current Labour leadership than he did the Thatcherite. But just reflecting, saying you know it went wrong, and we had all these names, and they seemed to go right, and now we've created something that's pretty bad. And we need to wake up to it.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear that, because someone it was talking about Gordon Brown, and they said he had a constipated approach to apologising. And I thought, I think that was a really nice way to sum up someone like that. But it was nice to hear there was another Chancellor who was quite happy to say, we did something wrong. I would imagine George Osborne would still stand up and say that austerity was something that the country needed to go through for it to have any chances of success or things like that. There was a character, I can't remember if it was Nigel Lawson or Norman Lamont, and I think he said to him, who were you, whose economic ideas and influences did you follow? And he said, oh, my own. And I thought that was a wonderful insight. Can you remember who it was?
I think I'm pretty sure that was Nigel Lawson.
Was it Nigel Lawson?
I remember putting the question to him about Hayek and co. And he sort of dismissed it. I didn't read those people. All my ideas were my own from my experience working at the FT as the FT leader writer and the Telegraph in covering the city. And his views completely came from his experience. He was completely... He was probably the most arrogant man I interviewed, full of self-belief. And at the time, you know, he wasn't Chancellor, you know, he'd long finished his political career. I interviewed him in the House of Lords, and he had huge respect. And while we were talking, other lords and ladies would come by and they'd go, oh, hello, Nigel. Like he was a revered figure. And when you would speak to someone, some high up permanent secretary or historical character, and talk about the change, they said, oh, well, you must read Nigel Lawson's biography. And this sort of 1,000-page plus book sort of became the Bible of Thatcherite economics. And everyone read that since. They may not read Hayek and Friedman, but they'll read Nigel Lawson's book about how it's done. And he was full of that. But when I met him, he was also, at the time, denying global warming and climate change.
Yeah, I was just about to lead to that.
He was right about the economy.
Yeah, he was just as right about the economy as he is about the climate crisis. But that arrogance was so evident. It reminded me of the story of Donald Trump when he was in front of the Scottish executive, as it was at the time before it was the Scottish government, and he didn't want any windmills off the coast of his new golf course, and he said he'd consulted experts in wind turbines, and they said who, and he said me. And that just that's what I would have expected from certain individuals that you cover in the book. That I've read a 4-page pamphlet, therefore I am the expert. But I've met a few chancellors when I was doing my job at the Council of Mortgage Lenders, but I was never able to sit down and interview them. And how I would love to do that now, Aeron. So I'm very envious that you got to do that. Something that I was really heavily influenced by in your book was something called the Wimbledon effect. Could you briefly explain for our audience what that was and how important and how big an impact that this Wimbledon effect has on the economy that we have at the moment?
Well, the phrase was told to me by a former head of the Department of Trade and Industry, a permanent secretary. And he explained the term, but he said it was widely bandied about. And the view was, as he put it, we have this big international competition, which brings the best tennis players in the world to England. Now, we may never win Wimbledon, although Andy Murray had just won it recently. He said, "Okay, forget that." But we won it now. Maybe few and far between, but we attract the best. And that was the same philosophy about industry. It didn't matter whether we had great British industries. What mattered is that successful industries set up shop in the UK. And that was the view, and that was the view of policy. So how that played out is you were not in the Treasury ever supposed to support homegrown industry in any way, and so the DTI was shrunk into a tiny version of what it was, and British industry was not backed. Although many other countries, including the US and Germany and Japan, all these others, put far more support into their homegrown industries, but we didn't, because they thought it'd be okay as long as we attract. So instead of supporting them, we almost supported successful industries like the Japanese car makers far more than we ever did homegrown industries, because you wanted to attract the new industries, and they would pay taxes and bring employment, and that was the thinking, without thinking ever about the negatives, about whether those companies at any point in the future might decide they could get a better deal elsewhere and move their entire setup somewhere else, with financial services, with industry. And it's clear, when Britain's no longer an attractive place to invest in for whatever reason, including leaving the EU, because that's a big hit to, many of the Japanese and American companies set up in Britain because they had access to the single market, and that was an easy way. And once you cut those links, what's the point of being in Britain anymore, really? You may as well set up shop in France or Germany or Romania instead. So that's the problem with the Wimbledon effect.
The current plan for Scottish independence after the transition period, so Scotland's independent, is that we retain the pound. So this would mean that an independent Scotland would still have the Bank of England, and really importantly, it would still have the Treasury as the paymasters in Scotland. And without reading the book, I considered this to be an exceptionally economically naive position, right? But after I read the book, I think this is an outrageously dangerous approach. Now, do you think that any Scottish minister who read your book would still think it was a good idea having the Treasury in charge of an economy that wanted to be progressive and push itself towards a well-being economy?
Well, hopefully not. Because yes, there are a few things that come out of the book, and one of which is you can see it, the long-term statistics, and people have looked at it from outside the Treasury, although the Treasury is now aware of this issue, that the regions have all suffered over decades in terms of their economies, while London and the Southeast has got stronger. And you can see this in all sorts of charts and tables of the economy, from incomes and unemployment and all the rest of it. And so, yes, so Scott, as long as control is centered in the Treasury in Westminster, that will continue. And so that would be a continuation of that. The second thing is the Treasury as it is, with a centre-right view, it is anti-investment, anti-expenditure, pro-small state. That's its natural tendency. Now, there's a lot of there are a lot of public-minded people in the Treasury who wish to do other things, who are public-minded people and would like to do things better. But the institutional drivers are stronger than that, and their tendencies are against that, against public investment. So for those two reasons, it would be, it wouldn't be a good idea for the Treasury, the London-based Treasury, to maintain control of the levers, or some of the levers.
As you said there, the evidence is there. As part of the United Kingdom, we've clearly not been a priority. So the idea that as an independent nation, we would be a priority seems to be, as I said, economically naive, but particularly just an impossible situation for us to end up in. Interestingly, the Scottish Central Bank, and I don't know how this is going to happen, but when we're independent, there's an independent Scottish Central Bank, according to the Scottish government at the moment, and there's a Bank of England issuing the currency and Treasury kind of controlling the economy. It's going to be involved in the regulatory mix, this Scottish Central Bank. And I just thought, looking at your experience from what you observed within the Treasury, how well does an economy work when there's a complicated regulatory mix? Because I think this was one of the kind of technical reasons there was a huge issues around the financial crisis. Would you agree, or was that not the right reading of that?
Well, definitely it was a reason for the financial crisis. And it's often a reason for lots of things that go wrong in government. I'm currently looking at housing issues in New Zealand. And you quickly learn that a big problem why it's not being dealt with adequately by government is housing responsibility falls across several different departments. And when I looked at the financial crisis, that was one of the lessons. There were lots of reasons it happened, and it happened as it did in Britain, although it was a worldwide event. But yes, no one was quite sure who had responsibility between the Bank of England and the Treasury and other bodies, who exactly was supposed to be dealing with it, and the Financial Services Authority as well. And it fell between the three of them.
There's a wonderful Spider-Man gif that I don't know if you've ever seen, where both the Spider-Men are pointing at each other. And I get that impression when we look at the financial crisis. It really was the Bank of England pointing to the Treasury, who were pointing to the FCA, I think it was at the time. But that complication, I think, was, as you highlight in the book, a real worry. I've really, really enjoyed that, and I feel that I feel like I'm an economist who's looking forward. And I said we're not going to go into MMT, but I feel kind of ecological economics and modern monetary theory is looking forward to something new. And I don't think we've got that baggage, which I think you've highlighted is a huge issue. And I'll leave you with a quote from my favorite economist, J.K. Galbraith. And he says, "It is far, far better and much safer to have a firm anchor in nonsense than to put out on the troubled seas of thought." And again, I think that's a nice summary for the Treasury. Yeah. Aeron, thank you so much for spending this time with me. It's been fascinating. Congratulations on the book. And if you're writing one about the housing market in New Zealand, I'll definitely be interested in that as well. Thanks for your time.
I'll let you know. Thanks. Great to talk to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for all your comments and questions. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to bring Karen back on screen as well. Hello, Karen. You watched that again? Any other thoughts watching through it again?
Yeah, I think probably also as well, something that really struck me was the idea of the Wimbledon effect. You wrote about that also for the National, but just the madness of that idea. I'm really struck by the madness of, and just the belief in it. And then also Nigel Lawson's self-belief, which was quite gargantuan, according to Aeron as well. And I remember I worked in Waterstones in Dundee, and his book about the climate crisis was published when I was working there. And I remember thinking, it's probably not a good idea to pay attention to economists writing about climate change, because I think they're probably conflicted. So, yeah, clearly he was.
Yeah, there was some loads of stories there. Yeah, I think the point you raised about the Wimbledon effect was really important. And for me, that sums up one of the huge problems with mainstream economics is they see a pound as a pound. They don't really think about it as a matter of power and what power that money gives you. So they just saw a pound coming in from, you know, a foreign multinational with returns going to that person who owns that pound the same as if it was me or you putting in that pound. I also think it talks to this lack of understanding about how an economy has to be made up by these trophic levels. You know, you can't just have a financial services sector. You can't just have a services sector. You need to think about your supply chains and how every sector supports every other sector. Just not really on the radar. They just see money as just something so simple and without power and without a kind of connection to wealth. And yet, really interesting, a really good example, I think, of the danger of following an idea like that. I said in the extended interview to Aeron that this for me was a really good example of what Dominic Jarrett in his book Collapse picks up on. He says very often we have huge damage done because we follow or we make false analogies. And someone said, hey, this is a bit like Wimbledon. And that was all that was needed because it was such a powerful kind of analogy. People didn't really think it through. So loads of interesting stuff from that. I hope you enjoyed it all. As I said, we've got an extended interview, almost an hour with Aeron to our paid subscribers of our Patreon, and you can do that for as little as £3 a month, which really helps us support our events and our projects and all the other things we're doing. Kieran, what's the equinocracy? Did you have a chance to have a look at that?
I didn't. I'm afraid I didn't look. But what he was talking about was the Manchester students who were looking at what they were being taught and just realizing this doesn't make any sense to me, which is the experience that you had when you were in Dundee as well. And clearly lots of other people were having that experience as well.
Yeah. That's in the extended interview. It's also a story that Steve Keen tells about his undergraduate when he was in Sydney, and just kind of putting up his hand and saying, you do realise that this is all absolute nonsense, but not doing that until his final year. So there you go, Hashbury. That's right. I think it's an organisation that basically came out of, it was a student body after the financial crisis, I think, who all got together and said, why were we not taught any of this? So Kieran's going to have a little look and tell us about it next week. Next week's episode, actually, we're going to look at our Festival of Economics because it starts a week on Thursday/Friday. So we're going to have a little preview episode for all of those who are planning to join. There's over 100 now have booked tickets, so please do book your tickets soon if you do want to come. We're going to have a little bit of an overview and some details on what we're going to cover, and it'll be a really interesting episode for those who are not attending, and hopefully it'll encourage those who are not to join the Patreon, get some of that content, or buy the online ticket, which is only £30 and allows you to see close to 30 hours of content. So that's enough of a plug. We'll be all about plugs next week. Charles, you've got a question here. I'll just see if I can get to this before we finish. What mix of expertise apart from MMT economists would be preferable for a Scottish Treasury? Charles, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. And I think it is to have a mix of economists. I don't really know how that would work because no one does it. It would be really interesting. But for me, a really important point to make about that is that the Treasury has to be filled with people who are not economists. And there's a famous quote from John Maynard Keynes who says, in an ideal world, an economist would be viewed similar and would be as humble as your local dentist. And I think we've got to aspire for our economists to have influence, but not influence way beyond their capabilities or their station. So I think economists have to have a less important role within any branch of government. That's my thought. I think the power of an economist is to say, I don't know the answer to that. That's not within my field. Ask someone else. Good luck finding a neoclassical mainstream economist.
I'd like to put another train of thought into that as well. So obviously now, as a councillor and a paid politician, you are looking to your civil servants for their expertise. Absolutely, you are. But if I was in a position where I was an MP and I was maybe a high up MP where I'm looking to these people for advice, my ideal situation would that I'd have 2 or 3 people with completely different sets of thinking, and they lay them out in front of me. And I, as the politician, have to make the decision based on the politics as well. So, that's another consideration that economists don't have. And it's the same in lots of other fields in your civil service, which is, they don't have to think about the politics. And that's exactly why they're doing a civil service job, because they don't have to think about that and they don't want to get involved in that. And that's what you have to do. And you have to take the headlines if you've made a bad decision.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I'll finish with a little story. And there's a story from America where an economist was asked to calculate what a new policy would do, how many jobs would it create. And he went away, he did his calculations, and he went back to the policymaker and he said 500. And the policymaker said, oh, that's not high enough. Can you go back and can you look at the sums again? So he went back, changed some assumptions, changed some sums, came back and said, oh, no, it's now 1,000. No, that's not high enough, said the policymaker. And he went back and the economist came back with and said, oh, I've looked at the sums again and I expect 10,000 new jobs. And the policymaker said, perfect, that's what we'll go with. Now, this is a bit of an urban myth in the profession, but we know that is happening, and we know there's a huge issue around economics because there's no code of practice. There's no ethical boundaries that would stop an economist doing that. So we've given a huge amount of power to a profession that has no moral code, no laws or standards like you would see with doctors and with lawyers. And I think that's a huge issue that we have to address as part of the United Kingdom, and certainly when we're looking to create our institutions as an independent nation. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this evening. We'll see you next week, and hopefully we'll see some of you in Dundee. Okay, thanks for the thanks, Charles. And we will see you soon. Check out our article in the National tomorrow, which you won't be surprised to hear is a bit of a plug for our Festival of Economics. Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.